Good day. My name is Lee Kim, and I have with me are Pastor Niraj Patel, Pastor Kong Jinai, and Martin Chow. We have come together to discuss and shed light to the claims of the Central Tibet Administration, CTA in short, with regards to the Shukden issue. In particular, we want to highlight the recent release of a new documentary entitled Shukden Protesters, Allegations versus Facts.
Completely baseless, it is clearly evident that the protesters are a fringe group of extremists and fundamentalists.
Now, there has been a press conference by the CTA on November 14th this year. The CTA has stated that the purpose of this 13-minute long documentary is to counter false narrative of religious persecution provided by a section of people calling themselves Shukden followers. Would you like to share your general point of view on this?
So over the last 20 years, since the Dojo Shukden ban has been first implemented in 1996, what we have seen is a accumulated large amount, a huge body of evidence which proves that the Shukden ban does exist. On the one hand, you've got all this evidence which comes from both personal accounts as well as independent media agencies which have covered the ban, which show that Shukden practitioners do suffer this kind of discrimination. And on the other hand, you've got this one single article, this one single report by Reuters, which the Central Tibetan Administration repeatedly bring up again and again to assert that there is no ban on Dojo Shukden, and actually Shukden practitioners have some kind of link to China. When we talk about the evidence that Shukden practitioners have, which proves that there is a ban, it's not just personal accounts of people who've experienced this kind of pain and this kind of division, but also accounts and coverage provided by media, independent media, who have covered it without any kind of bias and with great objectivity. For example, Al Jazeera covered it quite extensively. Then you have Swiss TV, who also covered it, as well as France 24.
For the ones who follow the teaching of the Dalai Lama, Shukden is simply a spirit that brings evil.
My husband worked 35 years for all this. Only few victims are willing to speak out against this persecution.
The Dalai Lama accuses Shukden of being a devil and his followers of siding with China, betraying the Tibetan struggle.
And I'm not even going to mention about the countless number of articles on the internet which actually support the fact that there is a ban against Dojo Shukden and that there is discrimination against Shukden practitioners.
Adding on to what Pastor Jinai said, the very fact that the administration has released this particular documentary shows that there is a ban on Dojo Shukden. Why else would a government zero in on a certain religion and demonize practitioners?
To further discuss about this video, I would like to take a quote from the press conference write-up. It says, Sikyong also added that these misguided people are being manipulated by the Chinese government to advance their propaganda of maligning the good name of His Holiness the Dalai Lama and the just cause of the Tibetan people led by the Central Tibetan Administration. Now, in this video, there's also an emphasis on a Reuters article which was published in December 2015 entitled China Co-opts Buddhist Sect in Drive to Discredit Dalai Lama. And it is used like evidential fact to support this allegation that China is behind the protests, and more accusingly, they're saying that Shukden practitioners have the objective to slander and defame His Holiness the Dalai Lama. Now, let's talk about how baseless this is and the fact that it is a very dangerous claim.
Lee Kim, let me pick up on something that you had quoted earlier, which is that Shukden followers are somehow misguided or falsely guided by the Chinese leadership. It is actually very inaccurate to deal with Shukden practitioners, Shukden followers, as one homogeneous mass.
Would it be conclusive to say that this leaked Chinese memo could have been taken out of context or misconstrued for the purpose of a different agenda?
Probably. I wanted to highlight one thing. The Reuters article is premised on this one line in the said internal memo of the Chinese government. That's the evidence. But at the same time, you have people like Lama Seta who claim over and over again that he's got very good evidence. Why would you need to refer to one line of a Chinese memo when you are supposed to have all this good evidence?
Well, if you look at the article and you read the article objectively, you will see that at the beginning, Reuters claims that there was research and information pertaining to China supporting these protests. And then somewhere along the line later, you have another line quite discreetly slotted in. It's like a disclaimer saying that they actually have no solid evidence. So perhaps they realized that there was a problem, yet the article needed to be published.
You see, because it's been almost 20 years.
Yep.
The very fact that after 20 years, someone has to come out and now reaffirm the ban, reaffirm the reasons for the ban, and then point to very, very baseless and flimsy evidence as to why the ban had to take place, and then turn around and say, but there's no ban. It's all very confusing.
Right. This is not the first time that the Central Tibetan Administration or Tibetan government makes allegations towards the Chinese government and their actions, right? In fact, it is quite clear that the objective of associating Shugden practitioners with China is to demonize Dorje Shugden and to marginalize the people who practice Dorje Shugden. However, it is also clear that this anti-China stand does not apply across the board with CTA. Isn't that the case?
You're right, Lee Kim. This is a tool that is being used by the administration. There are many examples of Tibetans who have strong connections with China, who are open about their connections with China, but are not branded Chinese spies or conspirators trying to bring down Tibetan society or the Tibetan administration. For example, you have Zongzai Khyentse Rinpoche, who has traveled extensively to China and has many teaching centers in China. He is not branded a Chinese spy or a Chinese conspirator. Similarly, you have Akong Tulku, who was based in Chengdu, and you also have Amchok Rinpoche, who was His Holiness the Dalai Lama's personal biographer, who lived in Dharamsala in India, but recently moved to China and has received Chinese citizenship. Both of these figures have not been branded Chinese spies or Chinese conspirators trying to bring down Tibetan society. So it's very clear that the administration are using this Chinese spy label as a weapon against people who do not follow the party line.
Lee Kim, we're not asking for the lamas that Pastor Nero just mentioned to be labeled as Chinese spies or traitors to the Tibetan community. We're not asking that for that at all. What we're trying to highlight, what Pastor Nero is trying to highlight, is that there is an inconsistent application of this China spy traitor label that the Tibetan leadership keep using. If you want to use it for everybody who's got connections with China.
Another example of this inconsistency surrounding the label Chinese spy is the example of Rangzen versus Umailam. At an earlier period, His Holiness the Dalai Lama had been advocating for Rangzen, which is complete independence for Tibet. Later on, His Holiness changed his stance to Umailam, or the middle way approach, which advocates meaningful autonomy within China. Those people who had been advocating for Rangzen were overnight branded as traitors and labeled as Chinese spies. This clearly shows that this is just a weapon being used by the administration against those people who do not follow their policies.
I like your use of the word weapon because it's actually quite clear to see why there's a need for the Chinese link. Bear in mind that the ban started 20 years ago. And after about 19 years, it became very clear to many people that the initial reasons given for the ban were becoming quite hollow. And people were now beginning to see through and came to the conclusion that it doesn't add up. So there has got to be another reason. Now, China is a highly, highly sensitive issue. The very mention of the word China would provoke all kinds of very strong emotions in the average Tibetans. So when the CTA aligns what really hurts the Tibetan, what scares the Tibetan, what angers the Tibetan people, which is a Chinese issue, when the CTA aligns it with the Shugden, then they managed to harness all this negative energy towards Dorje Shugden and the practitioners. When they do that, and because it is now a very highly charged emotional issue, they don't have to logically explain why there's a ban. They don't have to explain spiritually why Dorje Shugden is a demon. They don't have to explain why the earlier reasons, they're now silent on that. They don't have to explain how the Dalai Lama could be harmed. They don't have to explain how this whole failed Tibetan cause is due to one religious practice. So, I mean, it is very convenient for CTA to just say, well, they are to blame. And then everybody gets upset. And in many ways, the CTA has been getting away with it. And when you think about it, what is the proof? The proof is Reuters, a baseless article based on the testimony, very, very weak testimony of someone who is angry, disgruntled, and self-proclaimed to be in the know. It's very, very thin.
Right, so China is like a red hot button, like the nuclear bomb, and CTA is just playing around with this button and just actually quite willingly pressing it for their own agenda.
And it's that kind of uncertainty that Tibetans living within the Tibetan communities have to live with. When is it that their leadership is going to turn on them? When are they going to be the leadership's next target? Let me give you a simple example. This documentary, Shugden Protesters, Allegations versus Facts, was released by the Department of Information and International Relations. Now, this same department has spent the last 60 years demonizing China. Anyone who's got a connection with China is bad, is evil, traitors to Tibetan society, blah, 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 blah. A few days later, after releasing this 30-minute documentary, the same department then organized and hosted a workshop teaching Tibetans how to befriend China. They are now training their own people on how to become friends with the enemy. They are training their people and encouraging them to reach out to the Chinese leadership, to create Chinese connections, to create connections with the Chinese leadership. Are these people in the future, therefore, at risk of being labeled traitors? Are these people in future at risk of being labeled Chinese spies? The Tibetan leadership are very inconsistent with their application of policies, with the application of labels, and who they choose to demonize, who they choose to make the enemy on any given particular day.
But I think it can be quite purposeful, Kim. You see, by projecting a common enemy outwards, by focusing all the Tibetan people's attention on a imagined enemy, the CTA doesn't have to explain why after 50 years, they're still nowhere close to returning the Tibetan people to their homeland as they had promised many, many times. The CTA doesn't have to explain to the people what the future is, what the future plans are. The CTA doesn't have to explain why after 50 years, the Tibetan people are still in a very, very, in a state which is not desirable, with no programs, no future, and not likely to have any future. So it is very common for some governments or regimes to throw the focus out and so that people forget about the problems at home. I'll give you another example. It is when the economies in some countries become quite bad, they go to war. And when they go to war, everybody focuses on the war, on an external enemy, and forgets the problems back home. When you look at the state of the Tibetan people, I wouldn't want to be a Tibetan refugee with a government that has no plans for my future. Hence, it is very clear why they need to project an external enemy, and it has to be Dorje Shugden.
Yes, I want to add that Shugden practice actually predates any issues that the Tibetan leadership might now be facing with the Chinese leadership. Shugden practice has actually existed, has actually been worshipped for the last 400 years in Tibet. It predates any kind of Sino-Tibetan conflict, any kind of Sino-Tibetan issues. Countless lamas, countless monks, countless lay practitioners for the last 400 years have relied on Dorje Shugden without any problem whatsoever. Are the Tibetan leadership now honestly going to tell us that every single one of these practitioners over the last 400 years were all Chinese spies? Were they all connected with the Chinese leadership? Were they all falsely guided by the Chinese leadership? Does that sound logical to you, Lee Kim? No.
After listening to what Pastor Neral, Pastor Jinai, and Martin have shared, it has become clear that this documentary is not about slandering His Holiness the Dalai Lama, nor is it about who China wishes to support. But the simple fact that CTA is losing grounds for its ban against the practice of Dorje Shugden. Therefore, they pick on China, which is a very, very sensitive subject matter, and linking it to Shugden practitioners so that they no longer need to justify or explain why it's wrong. It's just wrong because it's associated to China. And China is so very sensitive. So if we put all the smokescreen aside, it's clear what this documentary is about. It is about the CTA admitting to a ban. It is about justifying the ban, which has resulted in unhumanitarian discrimination. So therefore, allegation out. Fact is, there is a ban. And on that note, I thank you three very much for spending your time and sharing the facts with us.